Well, welcome back. This is a follow-up to episode 1. This time I'm going to be asking Jon some questions, learn a little more about his background experience, what led him to create a cyber startup, why he made those decisions, what his goals were, and what's the difference between expectations versus reality, and any advice he has to share about the last, Jon, I guess it's 16 months now of doing this. So we'd like to get into it. Thank you all for joining us here. We officially have upgraded. We're no longer on Zoom. Now we're using a new application called Riverside. So hopefully we look and sound a little bit better. Still got a face for podcasting here, but this is
cool.
Cool.
Stop throwing out the free shout outs to different companies.
Right? It's a PLG approach,
but
right?
I do miss the Zoom. Yeah. Zoom. Somebody recommended that we call it the free Zoom podcast for a while, just because we were, the danger, right? The danger is that you and I can talk endlessly about, whatever. And the Zoom thing was convenient because it was like a hard cut at 40 minutes, right? Like can't go past 40 minutes. So it had to fit everything we wanted to. So welcome to the new era of the 6-hour podcast.
Right. Yeah. Do this on 5 times Zoom or a speed. You might be able to manage it.
You need that for my voice.
There's also, I feel like, we've been talking about that Copilot product on the coding side. I feel like on this video side, there should be like a video editor that's automated in some way, like that watches it and does a little bit of NLP to then say like, these are the best things and help to edit down. Because, I definitely create enough content with some words we say, but well, cool. Yeah. All right, let's get into it. So Jon, just want to give a little background on what you've been doing. You've had a decade in cyber. Let's set the stage for, you're about to make the leap and make a decision towards starting Salem Cyber and creating your own startup, but probably a little background on what the activities were you doing before that. You've had a decade, a couple different companies of experience. You just start there and probably a little flavor.
Yeah. So I was in kind of been a long time blue teamer in a couple different roles. First part of my career was in managed cybersecurity services, like big cyber data, I like to say, creating analytics for various MSS type products, basically, doing the whole bulk data, what information can we mine, and then switched to consulting, where I was doing that work for organizations directly, like typically like big or like very mature financial, energy, pharmaceutical, kind of the biggest sectors I was in, trying to help them wrangle the data that they have. So sometimes that's a data custodian job, and try to mine interesting insights from that data. And I think a lot of those insights and what I learned and observed is kind of what I brought forward as the genesis of, what our company does now, trying to solve some of those pain points that I had. I think what's really interesting about blue teamers that isn't really maybe talked about as much is how much interesting you can find. There's an unending sea of interesting insights that you can produce with all of this data that organizations collect. They're collecting, terabytes of data every day. And, there's so much that seems weird or, so much that you can say, like, maybe this is a reflection of a malicious actor doing, trying to attempt to do X, Y, and Z. And sometimes the way that you rely or arrive at those reflections is like really interesting. Like I saw, this process execute in this order, and like I recreate that on my machine, and it's me doing this. So every time that happens, maybe it's this thing. And the challenge is precision, right? Like you can definitely identify the thing that you're trying to identify, but the question becomes like, what else are you capturing? And can you effectively filter out that what else? And then ultimately what you produce, is it going to be actionable? And it's a hard job. It's a fun job, if you like data analytics, but it's a hard job because you end up creating a lot of stuff nobody wants or nobody uses because it's not actionable. Like dashboards are the best example. Every product in the world has a dashboard, and I like to think of those as like day one features. Like you turn it on and you play with everything and it's cool, but then like you don't go back to it because there's no pull, right? Like you have to choose to go look at this dashboard. You have to choose, what does this mean to me? And most of like, the monitoring response side of operations, which are like kind of consumers of the things that I was creating, they want like action driven. This thing happens means I need to do that. This thing happened means I need to do that. This thing happened. There's nothing to do. Shout at the people who sent me this data so that they never send me that data again. And I get it, right? Like it's very interrupt driven. It's very intense. It's very, repetitive in some ways, but also, really taxing kind of role. And, they really need, the most specific information, the most actionable information in front of them and, everything else off the table so that they can be the most effective. So anyways, a long way to say, like, that was my life, right? Like trying to enable people who did like monitoring and response to be successful, to have like actionable information. And, I assume the follow on is like, well then, why did you leave that world?
Well, actually, let's pause that real quick.
The answer is somewhat, yeah.
Well, let's pause on that for a second, because you gave a lot of different insights and background into the specific jobs you did in blue teaming, but maybe just double click on a couple. First, would you mind just giving a very simple view of like what blue teaming is, who those folks as a blue teamer you interacted with, and like what's the value provided as part of that? Like what was the job you really did and as part of the overall workflow? And then finally, what were some of the pain points you saw? So just a quick recap of those. I think you covered pieces of it for sure. If you mind just, for someone who like 2021 Trevor.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, at some point somebody decided it was a good idea to refer to different teams by certain like colors, like blue being defender, red being attacker, and then there's also this concept of purple, which you can imagine is the blend of the two. So the defenders are responsible for detecting bad actors. And so there's a number of ways that you do that. There's lots of technologies that do detection. There's a lot of systems that send data, and you can write your own detections and signatures and stuff like that. But basically, you're trying to catch bad actors trying to take advantage of data systems and stuff like that. And then the counterparty there, the red teamers, are the folks I think probably more aware of that, attempt to break in and test the defenses and test the monitoring and response capabilities. So I was a defender side, going back to my soccer days, always been a defensive focused person. And so that's basically what, when we talk about blue team. The purple team concept, just because I brought it up, basically you have like attackers and defenders working together. So, I'm going to try to do these things like, okay, like this is how I would try to detect that. And then like the process of back and forth, creates better, more precise end results because you have live fire exercises going on. That's the toughest thing about the blue team job is you're creating detections for what might happen, but like may never occur. And so validation can be hard, and that's kind of where that purple plays into it.
Excellent. Awesome. You mentioned also earlier you mentioned analysts and you were an engineer. What's the dynamic between those two, and what does that workflow look like when you're creating these different detections, and what happens after that?
I'd love to say it's harmonious. Unfortunately, I worked in a lot of places where it's like adversarial in a way. And I think part of the problem is that you're creating, as like a blue teamer, as an engineer, you're creating work for analysts. So everything that you produce, somebody is, supposedly taking an action on. And so if you produce a lot of things, they now have to do a lot of work. And there's kind of a weird like mindset difference between some of those groups. So like I've encountered a lot of people in the blue team space who feel like I do in a lot of ways that each of these alerts are like Schrodinger's cats, right? Like you don't actually know what it means until you look at it. So like I can't tell you it's not bad, so maybe we should look at it. And then on the other side, it's like, I can't look at everything, right? Like there's a whole sea of possibilities here. So only give me the most interesting things, the most actionable things. And that back and forth can be difficult because the objectives are kind of like diametrically opposed, right? Like I need to detect the bad guy. And so I'm going to do all these things to detect it. But then like, the operations side needs to be able to take action on that information. There's only so much they can action. And so there's kind of this natural tension. And so a lot of organizations, when you look at like org design, end up passing that role around. So I've been in organizations that have like dedicated engineering, and I've had organizations where like the SOC is doing their own engineering because they're like, we can focus on, what's important to us better. And then a lot of times the skill set's different, right? Like somebody who is an engineer who can configure tools doesn't necessarily, like it's more of like a cut and dry job in a lot of ways. And so sometimes you'll find like engineers are less analytical, but more able to, make the tool sing. And then the analysts sometimes are less, they're like very analytical. That's the job to be. But have less of a basis, like a technology basis to figure out how to get the tools to do the right thing. And so then, you end up with these two classes of things, and they kind of interact in this, odd dance that continues on forever.
Yeah, that sounds like a big friction between that, obviously humans and process, and sounds like a big issue you saw there. Are there any other ones that seems like a big one that might inform what you did next? But anything else any specifics that you saw there? If not, I'd love to jump in a little bit more about your leap then.
Yeah. There's a million things that you could say. Okay. I think I already did my talk on the dashboards and the value of those things. Okay. So yeah, it's anyways, I love that, and I think it's probably important to say, like, I loved being a blue teamer. It was a great role. It was a lot of fun. It was really interesting, and you're always like trying to do something new and trying to figure new things out. Like, how do I figure out when this happens and that happens? It's a really cool type of role. Awesome. And I enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like you had a lot of great experiences there, and also saw a lot of different issues and ways that people were trying to solve it. As you then advanced in your career, now you're about a decade in, and you've done certainly well and advanced in certain organizations. Gotten to a certain point. So what then led you to believe that and go off on your own and start a startup in cybersecurity? Mind just giving us what built that moment? What helped you lead to those decisions?
It's complicated, for sure. I loved my consulting job. Consulting's not for everybody, but it was kind of for me. I really liked it. I was starting to get a little burned out on the travel. The dynamics of the world helped solve that problem before I left. So it certainly wasn't that. I think the moment that I really like to talk about is right at the end of 2020. I took a lot of time off. I took off between Thanksgiving and New Year, which is like 6.5 weeks, something like that in 2020. And I went, to my wife and I have a little ski cabin. I went there and just did nothing. And I had planned this all out. I was like, you know what, I'm going to take this block of time off. And in that time, about 2.5 weeks in, Rachel wasn't even there. She was like back working, and she was like kind of coming and going. I was just kind of sitting around, and the space that not having to worry about work or, kind of like the day-to-day whirlwind, really put me in a space where I started thinking deeply about like, what did I want to do? And, what does success look like for me? I was having a fantastic career at a fantastic company. And I started thinking like, am I going to look back 30 years from now still doing this and think like, this is the thing that, defines success for me? So you had that. And then I think once I got into that headspace, it became about, what would you do? Like, what are the types of problems that you think you can solve? I've had a lot of experience, seen a lot of pain points at a lot of big-ish, semi-mature, mature organizations. And yeah, started, kind of the genesis again of what this became. The best part of that story to me is when I thought I had an idea, I wanted to like pitch it to myself to make sure it was good. And so I was like trying to get the pitch down. And so I'd go out on the slopes and I'd pitch myself on the chairlift going up, and then I'd ski down real quick, and then I'd like pitch myself on the way up. Because it was like a nice time box, like the chair takes 8 minutes, right? And so I've got 8 minutes to get through this whole story and narrative. And I did that for a couple of days before I really kind of locked in, like, yeah, I think this is a problem worth solving, and it's a problem I think that I can go solve. And, the final point on that is like, well, why not do this at a big company? You certainly can innovate in big companies, but it's hard to focus on more than one thing and be successful at that one thing, especially when you're starting at nothing. And so to me, the only real way to bring to life what I thought I could bring to life was to find a space where I was totally insulated from everything else, and that was the only focus that I had. And to me, that meant, leaving and starting a company as opposed to, going some of the other routes. Unfortunately, I found myself in a position where I could do that. But, I tried in various other avenues to do, two things at once. And neither of those things really get to the place where you want them to be, because it's difficult to focus on multiple priorities, especially ones that are, so different and, demanding in their own unique ways.
Yeah, you're preaching the choir on that one. I totally get that.
Yeah,
it is very interesting to see, because I was in a similar position as you about a year afterwards, though, and making those big life choices. So maybe the next piece is then obviously you get excited about like what it could be and all the optimism and like the build and like, here's the idea. Let's go think through all the different little nuances around it, all the different factors at play. Flip side of that then is, what about the downside? And obviously a lot of startups fail. A lot of things don't play out. So you start thinking about the idea, great building. Then what do you think about the downside? How do you evaluate risk in this light, and what got you to that ultimate decision of like the upside outweighs the risk here, both personally, professionally, et cetera?
That's there's the obvious risk of it fails, and then what do you do, right? And I think even in the environment that we're in right now, cybersecurity jobs are still really important. Cybersecurity is really important, and there's good jobs to be had. And so like the relative risk for me is, as an individual, was low enough that it was not a factor really at all. Mm-hmm. Some of the other things, though, I didn't necessarily anticipate in terms of, looking back, what is a risk? I've always been, I think, relatively even-keeled person. Got some advice kind of early in my career, like don't let yourself get too high, don't get too low, just kind of ride the middle. Mm-hmm. I've always been the rainy days make the sunny days feel that much better kind of person. Yeah. But this is an emotional roller coaster, right? Like the highs are so high and the lows are just so depressingly low. And the moment that they switch is instantaneous and you don't see it coming. It's like, continually getting hit by a freight train, and then, that freight train carrying you off into some like land of rainbows and unicorns, and then, whack, another freight train comes for you. And that, I think personally, has just been it's kind of like molded, interpersonal relationships and stuff like that in a way that I didn't necessarily anticipate. And I think if I was looking at this again, I would definitely have to put that on the risk register. Like, how is not only like the time element and like the financial element and all this stuff, but like, how is the emotional element going to then impact the people around me? And like, is that something that I'm willing, and those other people around me are willing to take on? I certainly couldn't do this if my wife said no, right? Like, I'm not going to be supportive, which, you'd have to respect, because she's looking at all these things too. But that kind of risk I wasn't prepared for, especially because, you want to be like, I am who I am. Like, it's not going to affect me, but like, wow, like that, very, very understated. And now like, kind of wish I had considered. Wouldn't have changed my decision, but I would have liked to be more eyes wide open about it.
That makes a lot of sense. I think we should kind of working backwards. We probably should get them on here at some point and see what their perspective has been.
Yeah.
As they
or not,
as they've been made that decision, then now we live in the decision. But I mean, cyber certainly is an incredible industry. If you're evaluating industries to go into to be an entrepreneur, this is got to be in the top 5 somewhere. So I think it was a great choice. And now you mentioned a bit of things you've learned since then. So maybe like a couple of topics I'd like to go deeper in there, like what did you expect to happen versus what did happen? What's the difference sometimes between expectations and reality? And then maybe some of the things along the way. What are some of your top learnings? I think some of them probably are cyber specific, but others probably are just totally unrelated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing, it's hard to take your own advice. I told people all the time back when I was consulting who had ideas, like, nobody cares about your idea. Like, you're not selling it well, like, gave all this like very pointed feedback. And then, it's so easy to fall in the loop of like excitement. Like, I'm excited about the technology. I'm excited about the potential. Like, and I just find myself explaining ad nauseum to people who like either don't care, don't get it, or some combination of don't get it and therefore don't care. And so you almost have to like step back to a simpler, direct story. And I've learned that you have to be a little bit like, you can't tell the cool parts of the story, right? Like, what's cool to me doesn't necessarily matter. Like, my story doesn't matter. It's their story that matters. And telling their story, a very like simplistic story, and they're being like the people who you're trying to create this capability for. That's been interesting. And then also, like, I had never really been the person who was like badgered much by like inbound sales. I got like a couple of like recurrent things, but it was like easy to swat away. And I talked about this a few times. Like, I thought it would be really easy to just like reach out to people on LinkedIn and be like, hey, like, I'm doing this cool thing. It might benefit you in these ways. Like, love to have a conversation. But even that message is like really hard to cut through, especially if you don't have like a basis of trust with that person, because as we see now, like, I get an unending amount of inbound whatever, and it's just hard to read. And then it just becomes like so clickbaity and stuff like that. And you find yourselves like, all right, I need a good hook, right? But then like, it just sounds inauthentic. And people in this industry in particular, they want authenticity, they want trust, and they can recognize in a heartbeat something that they feel is inauthentic or, manipulative or something like that. Not like saying that we got down that road, but there's just so much out there. There's so much noise that you just get lumped in with everybody else. And, you find yourself like, should I play these like weird little games that everybody else does? And, fortunately the answer has been no. Like, let's not walk that path because it's not the right one for, what we're trying to do and the type of relationship that we're having. But that part's been a lot more difficult. And then, I was always aware of how slow companies are to do anything. But living it from this perspective gives you just a different lens of like, hey, we want to do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, great. Okay. Like, today's day one, like, we've all kind of agreed in terms, and they're like, no, today is, day minus, T minus 38 or whatever, 98. And we're going to go through all these processes and make sure everybody else is on board and, get all this paperwork in place. And then it's, who do we need to get involved and all this stuff that you observe, but like as an outsider, when I was in technology consulting, is just so much more like real, like so much more, frustrating maybe, but like also just like, you're trying to move as quickly as you can. You've got a lot of balls in the air, and you feel like you need the momentum, and it runs counter to what you actually need to do, which is to be patient.
Yeah, and I feel like we get hit on it both sides. Obviously we are trying to sell to someone, right? We hit on that side, obviously, right? But we also, I feel like, in certain scenarios, we're also the buyer, right? And we are the customer for others. And you'd expect then the certain level of customer success, support, et cetera, that we're trying to provide others. And when you don't get that, it becomes even more frustrating. Like, come on, like we're the customer here. Like, let's move. Like, we're ready to go. And
oh my God, yeah, we've definitely been there.
Yeah,
yeah. I'm recalling like one set of conversations in particular where I had to like stop the person. Like, I know what you do. I would like to buy what you do. Please stop telling me what you do, and let's just move on to the how much does it cost and how do I acquire said services. It was like. Right. We are the easiest sell for you today. Yeah. I was like, please, just let me go back to what I was doing. Let me pay you money for this thing. But yeah, I think in a lot of ways, like neither of us have been in that kind of sales roles before. So I'm sure if the walls here could talk about like all of the stupid things that I said to people and like, bad presentations that I gave.
But that's, I think, one of the places we evolve the most and the fastest, right, is how do we project ourselves externally, right? You want to project confidence in certain things. You want to be simple in your messaging, but like, how do you actually do that? and going through the nuance, I think that's where we've changed so much. That's a big, certainly for me, reality versus expectation too, of like how fast and how much that is versus, then how much the nuance matters. Some of the other learnings I'd like to know from you is, you've been a technologist by trade for years. You were an electrical engineer in undergrad. You've been in this technology realm. Now you're an executive, and you've got responsibilities that are much more broad than just build a product, deliver on a client's deliver client value around the product, around the technology. What else have you learned? What do you think are some of the things that surprised you most there?
In the transition?
No, you've been doing this now for 16 months. So I guess I'll give you a little running start here. I've seen you now, work on messaging. You created essentially 2 websites in a lot of ways, right? You've had to deliver our first flyer, first deck, help to get people investing, help to get customers excited about what we're doing. Actually get users on it, and then get them to do certain things, engage, and then lead a team that is, hybrid. There's so many different things that are somewhat of what we've done before, but in such a different way, in such a different lens, bigger beyond what we did.
Yeah. I think I'm a really good technologist, but not because I tried to be. And I'm certainly not like great, right? Like there's people who just like love the technology for the sake of technology. I've really always considered myself like a creative person and somebody who, and we were talking about this the other day, who's like a knowledge seeker. And I'm not sure that I really would have put it in those terms until very recently. And so when I think about like the work that I've done and what I get drawn into, it's one, like, I just like creating things, right? Like I like the creativity of like figuring it out and, creating something that's useful and, pretty to a certain extent. Pretty is probably a bad word, but like well aligned, like geometric, like still engineer. And so learning those things was something I enjoyed doing, right? And you're good at the stuff that you get pulled into. But I also enjoy like the interpersonal relationships. And so I like naturally get pulled into those. So leading teams of people, I wouldn't say I've always been really comfortable doing it, but it's something that I've enjoyed. And because of that, like I've tried to figure out like how to do it better, and be more effective and be more empathetic and, really inspire people to want to go forward and do great things. I think my role now, and in a lot of ways has been for a while, is to set other people up to be as successful and as productive as they possibly can. And I don't always do a good job of that, right? I can be combative at times, especially when I think I'm right and nobody's convinced me otherwise. I also think that I've got a little bit of the I'll just do it myself mentality when I should bring other people in, because it's like, well, I feel like I can do this better, but then like I got 1,000 things to do, so then it doesn't totally get done. So that's kind of not been great. But the counterpoint is like, what are the things that I don't enjoy? And those are the things I'm not great at, right? Like, I don't really enjoy the operation of certain machines. So, the sales motion in particular, like I'm not the best at following up and getting back to people, even though like I know I should, because I just, not something naturally that suits my personality type of, building those relationships. I feel like I have great relationships with people, but then like manufacturing those relationships is not something that I've really ever strived to do. And so all of the work that's related to kind of that type of personality, that type of function and machine, I'm really bad at. And you can't be bad at those things, right? And so that's kind of been part of the journey is, getting regiment around what I need to do, getting accountability towards the things that I'm not good at, and kind of like forcing yourself to, overcome that hurdle and recognize like, hey, you're focusing on these other things that don't matter as much because in part you like them more, but in part because it allows you to avoid this other thing that you should be doing. And there's something powerful in the recognition. And I've read just about every like how to start a business book that I can get my hands on. So,
Right.
Try to take from there as well and use that to like reflect on my own behavior. And you're like, what, I am doing that, or what, I need to be doing that better, and trying to like push and challenge to do those things.
Well, and I think that's like the biggest challenge in entrepreneurship really is like you can hear all those things, learn all these different things, but then you actually have to go do it. Right. So like there's you have to come up with an idea. Awesome. Right. That's a big part of it, but then you have to execute, right? That's a lot of ways the biggest part or the hardest part and the longest time. There's so many different factors that come in there. And that's where I think
just on that point real quick, I agree with the point that you made. But then you said the idea is such a big part. The idea is such a small part. Good ideas are everywhere. And, I think it's a lot to like overcome the hurdle to say like, this is the good idea that I'm going to run with, and like actually start going and running. But, if 90% of it was a good idea, like had a good idea a long time ago, and now it's to what you're saying, it's like actually the execution problem of bringing the idea to life and then building the entire machine around a business, like a whole product that's not just like, hey, here's a cool shiny thing, like, hey, here's a cool shiny thing that, fits into your workflow and your technologies and solves a problem that you're having and has, good support behind the scenes and is, constantly striving to enable you to be more successful, more efficient, and all of those things. Like, that's the 90%. The 10% or maybe even less is the actual idea. And I think maybe that's, a key to why so many startups fail. And this is a little bit like, we'll see how well these comments age moment. But I think, people go in with a good idea thinking that's all you need. A good idea, get some funding, whatever, and it'll work. But, the world is riddled with failed good ideas. And there's, exponentially more good ideas that were never actioned on. I think it's, the point that you were starting to make, it's about the execution.
Yeah, totally. And there's also the execution phase that brings out so much more, because there's also plenty of things that people thought were good ideas that then as they get borne out during execution don't become. They clearly aren't, and you only find out until later. And it's hard to really parse out exactly where each of those lie. But I think as you and I go through each of our days, like prioritization, and you mentioned like some things you could do better if you had more time to focus on it, but you had to pick your battles and to focus on where you invest your time and effort and resources to go actually move that. And to me, that's one of the biggest battles we've been facing is prioritization. And but that's how we move forward, and we'll continue to evolve. And it really, to me, being in the game as an entrepreneur, you don't know what to expect next. You mentioned you've been surprised by some things that are outside of your control, and that then influences what you do next. So having that ability to stay flexible, because you need to have a plan, you need to go execute, but then staying available to things you didn't already know or didn't believe could be an opportunity, then become one. So that's great. Is there any other advice you'd offer up to people looking to be an entrepreneur or entrepreneurs who are currently out there looking to grow and advance and how to do it best?
Yeah, I think do it, right? Go for it. You're going to need to be able to do everything yourself as you're getting going. And there's a lot to learn, but there's kind of a million resources out there. So if you're somebody like me who, loves to consume information, there's really not too much standing in your way. I mean, there's, big tech companies are providing so many benefits to startups. Venture firms have done a really great job of providing like free resources on understanding how like funding works and like stub like contract templates and stuff like that. Communities are building incubators and accelerators and stuff that, aren't taking equity and are just kind of there for the good of you. So if you're somebody who has an idea and you can dive in and make it work, and you can do a lot of the heavy lifting to get from like idea on the page to something that exists well enough in the real world, there's literally nothing stopping you, and you can move as fast as you're capable of moving. I think there's never been a better time to be a tech entrepreneur. And if you're solving a problem that would have helped you, chances are there's a lot of people who were in that same situation. And so I'd say go for it. There's almost no reason not to. I
totally agree. You mentioned there's so many resources and so many things that you've looked at and learned from. Any top ones that come to mind that you would suggest for others?
Yeah, well, I'll plug. They give us a lot of stuff, so I'll plug them. The Microsoft for Startups, from like a technology perspective, has been really helpful for us. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of books that I've read that I've really enjoyed. The Lean Startup, I really enjoyed and probably read through like 8 times. I also really enjoyed this book called Spin Selling. Their background is at Booz Allen. They were like doing courses on it, and unfortunately, the one I signed up for, I was like the only person, so they canceled the course. But it's really interesting in that it talks about kind of the stuff that I talked about in terms of like discovery of how to make connections with people, how to focus on needs and not features and not benefits. You have to solve a problem. And so somebody who had never really been in that world, the concepts there were really impactful now, like figuring out how to operationalize them is another thing. Mm-hmm. And then Venture Deals is a good book. I'll have to post the authors of these books somewhere, talking very specifically about like the different vehicles for financing as you think about those things. But the best resources, honestly, people you know and trust. People want to help you out. People want the people they know to be successful. Mm-hmm. Before I convinced you to join full time, you were helping me out, figure out some of like the finer points of, establishing a business and planning for capital and all sorts of things that were really impactful. There's been other people who've helped me figure out how to build better relationships. There's people who've helped me, ideation and stuff like that. And I think in this moment, like if I didn't do all of those, I can't list everybody's name out. Yeah. But that has been the resource, the best resource is people that I know who have been not only willing, but like excited to help out however they can. that's the best.
Awesome. That's great advice. So thanks for that. I appreciate it. So now,
And can I actually say one other thing? There's people in that group that I would have never expected to be the person to like be helpful and like want to be helpful. So it's like one thing to say like, oh, well, great. You have a bench of people who are smart and capable and know things who help you out. But what's interesting is it's not necessarily the people I thought would be on the bench helping me out. It's been like people I knew, well, or kind of well, or maybe not even that well, who have been the ones who really jumped in and been like, I'm here for this. I'm here for you. Like, let me help.
Excellent. That's great. So, John, I think a lot of that has gotten us to where we are today and helps us prepare for tomorrow. So what does tomorrow look like? What comes next for you, for Salem Cyber?
Yeah, well, the 2021 was, John in a dream in a van, trying to figure things out. What?
And a boat, not a van, right?
In a boat, yeah. So I didn't have a car. I had a boat. How great for me. Sold the boat, unfortunately, though. Casualties of war, I guess. Anyway, 22 was really about turning a thing that I was doing by myself into a business, and kind of like the foundations of everything that's required to run a business. And I'm hoping 23 is about scale. It's about getting more precise on exactly how we're solving problems, the types of people that we're solving those problems for, and getting those stories out to other folks who are in a position where, they need things that they don't have access to, or they're underwater, or, other kinds of like stories that fit into, where our solution has gone. Getting that message out and growing and scaling a business. And then, been successful with 2021 to 2022 has gone pretty good. So hopefully that's a success. And then, who knows in the out years, then it just becomes things that are so far away and fascinating and scary that I'm not even sure I can articulate them right now. But hopefully next year is about taking something that really works to people who really need it.
Absolutely. Well, and you mentioned earlier too, all the people around you has been like the greatest learning, greatest thing you've seen, and has been the best resource for you. I think that's why I'm also so excited for next year and what's to come after that too, is we've built a great community of folks around us on, with our team, advisors, friends of Salem, customers, and others in the cyber community and beyond. And that's why I'm so excited, is we've now got a lot of those folks excited about what we're doing, inspired about what we're doing, and also then teaching us a lot. So, John, thank you for coming on here. Obviously, I'll talk to you probably in 5 minutes about something else, but this has been great, and love to keep doing these. And thank you.